Hello everyone, and this is going to be the first video in a series of MuleSoft architecture discussions. I really want to put this together because sometimes if you're not a senior developer or a team lead or even a MuleSoft architect, you're not in these wonderful meetings where you get together and you just kind of solution what the architecture or your MuleSoft solution will look like. And I think these are great discussions that you can learn so much from other people's input and finding out about how the business really works behind the covers, not just for the technology, but in the business processes. So I kind of want to see if I can replicate some of those discussions and how I think about some topics when being proposed with a problem and how I come to solve it with a MuleSoft integration platform. Of course, these are all just my opinions. Feel free to jump in the comments or ping me if you have any other ideas or suggestions or comments. And in the real world, there really is an infinite amount of problems and infinite amount of solutions. So I'm trying to just start up a one-way conversation, potentially about some things I've seen before, some things that you might encounter in your workplace. So hopefully I might hit something that maybe you've seen in your past or coming up, or just spark a discussion to get you thinking about some other systems. So that's it. Let's dive into part one. The first section is called source systems, because usually a lot of the integrations that we're doing is taking data from the source system or from an enterprise system number one, doing some transformations, but essentially just moving it at the end of the day to another system, which I call a target system. And to get a great solution, what you really need is you need to understand these target and source systems. You can't really do this without knowing the full end-to-end. So I recommend don't just focus on the data when it arrives in your MuleSoft application. Really try to understand the systems that hold your data before you get to it. So for example, say you're moving data from Salesforce to another system. Get an account for Salesforce. Ask for it. Play around, look how the data is structured. If you're new to Salesforce, look how their common out-of-the-box objects are modeled, because that really helps you when you want to create your APIs around these RESTful objects. Are they one-to-one mapping? Are you ever going to update an order line without the order header? So stuff like that helps you create your RAML. And if you're doing multiple objects on your RESTful URL, you can kind of figure out like a payment. So a payment's not going to exist without an order. So you'll know kind of like your RESTful APIs, and I could talk more about this in another video in the series, but you would be /order number /payment, because you wouldn't be /payment because you never really need to deal with the payment in the context outside of an order. And you figure this out by looking at how Salesforce is structured. And a really good thing about getting in your hands dirty into Salesforce is, like, say if you're writing a close date field, you can go into Salesforce and say, oh, okay, that data is stored year dash month dash day, and it's a string. So now you can kind of make your RESTful APIs have that RAML as a string, because you don't want to be unnecessarily changing it from string to object to string to object. So I definitely recommend in your source system, get into the source system with an account and start seeing the objects that you are going to move. Now on to how we actually get the data from the source system into our MuleSoft application. Oftentimes this would be a negotiation. Even if you have an architect or someone on another vendor telling you this is how we need to send it to you, I want you to ask them more questions about what that really means and see if there's other options. Because oftentimes they're just telling you what they're used to and they just want to hand it off to you. But if we can get a great solution between those two enterprise systems, but if we can understand the system and how it works, it'll help us design our integration solution. So don't just be a lazy developer and said they're going to send it to us in a flat file. Talk to them and figure out what's the best way for you two to communicate that will produce the best outcome. So in my experience, there seems to be three main ways. The first one is polar. I got a little bit of a flow here to describe it. So in MuleSoft, what it is, it's on a scheduler. That's a whole nother discussion. But a lot of times it deals with the business process, the system you're working with, how much memory you have. So for example, if the data that you're getting only gets written at a batch job at night, well, what's going to happen is when you do a scheduler after that time, you're going to get every single row for that day. On the next call, unless it's 24 hours later, you're not going to get any at all. However, if it's coming throughout the day, what you could do is have a longer time period scheduler, but then you're going to get more records. Or if you want, you can have a short time window. You'll get less records per invocation, but you'll be using less memory and less threads to get through it. So the poller triggers, and then you need to make an outbound request to get the records from the source system. So usually what you're trying to do is get records based on a certain ID or a timestamp, because you don't want to be importing every single record every day because you're going to get duplicates. So if there's a way to try to get only new records since the last time your scheduler ran, and usually this involves storing and loading up a watermark which could be host in an object store that MuleSoft provides. You pass in a query parameter that's like anything that was created after the last time this ran, which is stored in your watermark. Could be an ID. So a lot of times in databases, they have a primary key. And if you're just pulling off the top of a database, then you know that ID is incrementally increased. So you can say if you pulled record 45, the next time you want to pull anything that's from 45 and up. And again, you only know that if you knew that the source system was a database and that the database had that timestamp create the date, or it had an incremental ID. So that's why you have to talk with them, or else you actually physically go into their system, which I highly recommend. Once you get all the new records, you loop through each one of them, usually call a process API, and then you store your watermark. So that's kind of the basic outline of a poller. The second kind of trigger sync method is what I call an outbound request. That is when the source system will send you the data. So you build that API listener inside MuleSoft, and then they'll create it with the fields that you need. Another part could be, say, an FTP server or an S3 bucket. So they'll do a data dump to a listening folder, and then you grab it. So still, it's kind of like they're exporting the data and then sending it to you. But essentially, they're building something custom to send to you. And the third one, I call it a webhook. Some of the enterprise systems have this built in. Let me give you an example. So there's this single sign-on identity provider platform called Login Radius. And what they do is you can kind of subscribe to events. So for example, you could have a verify phone number. So every time a customer would verify their phone number. So for example, for a new account, let me send you a 4-digit phone code. They send it to you through like text message, and then you press OK or reply or enter it into a website. And that tells Login Radius that yes, we verified that this phone number belongs to you and it's valid. So what you could do is subscribe to that event, and you put in your web address of, say, a HTTP listener, and what happens is the system will automatically send you the details of that verify phone number. So in this drop-down box, there was like 15 different events that you could register to, and then you just put in your endpoint and you just hit add, and then if an event ever happens that say verify phone number, it sends an outbound request and it's out of the box. So you might think like number 2, outbound requests and webhooks are kind of the same thing. So they're sending the request to you that are listening in your integration platform. But there are some very important differences. So usually what happens is in the webhook, it's real time. So let me show you how it works inside code. So for example, in this method place, so this is when literally you have this is Magento. So this is like an e-commerce platform. So someone presses place order. This is the function that gets called. And what you have here is around the actual placement, the actual line that places the payment, you have these 2 webhook events, sales order placed before and sales order placed after. So this is where you could register your URL. And when this line gets called, for example, even though it's a different system, same type of thing, it'll look up for your configured requests to see if there's any of them that have been added. And if they are, send them the order the order object. So that's percent side this. So you're actually in the order.php. So you're in the order object. So send them this object. And then if you wanted like an event for after the order was being placed, you send them, you register for this event. So this is out of the box. So you don't actually get to choose what fields that you get. You literally get the whole object. So that's the great thing is you don't need a developer on the source system like Magento. I don't need to hire a Magento developer to say, hey, before the order is placed, send me the name, the shipping address, and the order details. This is out of the box and I get the whole order object. And then in my MuleSoft integration, I can pick and choose which field I want, or I could just ignore all the rest. So the outbound request needs custom code built, and the webhook is an out-of-the-box platform. Webhook is real-time. Outbound request gets a little tricky because someone's got to code it, and it really depends on how they architect their solution to send it to you. I have here an example of, say, someone coding an outbound request. So we say the source system is Dynamics CRM. So Dynamics CRM, if someone creates a new customer, we tell them we want them to send that new customer to our MuleSoft endpoint /v1/customer so that we can enter it into a target system. So this isn't there's no webhook for this in CRM. So what someone has to do is someone has to code in their supported programming language. So for example, in Magento, it's PHP. In Salesforce, it's Apex code. Most of these big systems have their own language. So Dynamics CRM, most of your coding you're going to do is in C#. So how would they code to send you the new request? What their solution might be is create a scheduler that every once in a while they'll look for new customers that have created. And then if they do detect one, create a web request and send it to MuleSoft. But that sounds very familiar. So that's essentially what we're doing with our Polar, right? So instead of taking this C# custom code that has a Polar, builds the object and sends it to MuleSoft, what we did in our Polar is has a scheduler, makes a poll to find new customers in Dynamics CRM, and then send the object to, say, a process API if you find any new customers. So you might think maybe outbound request is the exact same as Polar. So which one would we rather have, an outbound request or a Polar? And this is very company dependent. There's no best practice for this. It really depends on how your organization is structured. So the biggest impact I see between these two is how we manage changes in the future. So if we need any enhancements, it's typically going to be they need more fields or they created a new field in Dynamics CRM and we need to bring that over as well. So for example, say we have a new field on customer that we need to bring over. If we did a Polar, what we do is the field has been added to the customer object in CRM. They expose their APIs where I can just specify the field name in the dynamic URL. So Dynamics CRM publishes their APIs where I can get the object model customer or account in CRM and specify the field name. So all I would have to do is in this GET request is add the new field name to the HTTP GET request that I already have implemented. I could do that all by myself, wouldn't take long, and now I have the new field, and now I could pass it to the process API and essentially get it to the target system without the need for anybody else. But let's look what the exact same use case is in our outbound request. I have a new field I need to get. Well, that field's not being passed to me in my MuleSoft request. So what I need to do is go back to whoever wrote this C# custom code and say, hey, when you're pulling for new customer, I need you to get an additional field and then send it to me in my request. So I have to change my MuleSoft application to accept the new field and pass it along to the target system. But I also now am dependent on a coder to give me that new field. And this could be very problematic depending on how your company or organization is set up. If you don't have a CRM, first of all, if you have a CRM developer in your team, you're just dependent on another team, their release cycle. You have to beg for their time on your board to get it in their sprint. So at least it could be weeks, it could be months, depending on how busy they are. If they didn't have any CRM developers and it was, say, an external vendor, then you could potentially even have longer timelines. Because what happens if that vendor's no longer there? Well, now you got to go reach out to them. You got to get a PO. You got to open up a new contract. Or if there's an existing one, you got to ask a manager, hey, can I steal them from your project to add this field and use up your hours? So this you could potentially add in months of delay in order to get that change. So you could be done your MuleSoft changes in a day, but you're not going to release the feature potentially months down the road. So depending on how the structure and who you're dependent on to help you with the solution, if anybody, there's a very big difference on how fast you can get this change out. And if for that use case, the webhook, actually you probably wouldn't need any developer on the source system at all, because usually with the webhook, they can't guess what fields that you would want. So out of the box, they just give you the whole object, and then you can pick and choose which one you want. So to summarize this, all three of those sync trigger methods can get the job done, but it really depends on what is the best solution for your needs. And in order to choose the best one, you need to be informed. You can't just say, oh, I've done it like this before in other organizations. I know how to do it. It's easy. You really need to understand the source system. You need to understand, hey, if you send me this outbound request, how are you doing it? Or go into the documents of the source system, see if they have any webhooks available, and see what their published APIs give you. And I'm not saying become an expert in every source system. If you have someone in your company or another team that's the CRM expert, reach out to them and ask them like, hey, if you send me an outbound request, how do you actually do that? How is it implemented inside CRM? If they tell you like just call our internal API or we just call polling, ask them like, hey, what's the difference between that or if I was just be able to use their publicly available API? Or ask them, hey, if I ever need another field or another mapping, who would be the one who could help me with that? You take that information and now you can make the best decision on how you're going to get the data from your source system. So we're going to stop it there for part one. And now that we've discussed how we get the data in upcoming parts, we're going to try to walk through a whole end-to-end solutioning. And just like we've done today, maybe discuss some questions to ask or something to look into before you make your decision on how you're going to architect everything. If you're interested in following along, make sure you subscribe. And if you think this series is worthwhile to keep going, make sure you hit the like button to let me know. And we'll see you next time. Peace.